Hey, Eric Byler for TYT Politics. There are three avenues of investigation that could lead to articles of impeachment against President Trump. There is an investigation into possible collusion between American citizens and agents of a foreign government. There is an investigation into obstruction of justice. And then there is the matter of financial self-enrichment while in office. I recently spoke to Catherine Ross, a constitutional scholar at the George Washington University Law School. She's pushing Congress to begin an investigation based on the foreign and domestic emoluments prohibitions in the Constitution.
If we're talking about the domestic emoluments clause, which says very clearly that the president may not receive any form of compensation beyond his salary, that is to avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety, and even exposing the president to the temptation that he might put his own interests above those of the country. That suggests that any sort of business dealings while he's in office are forbidden.
It's a public opinion and a political proposition, really, when it gets to the impeachment level. Yes. I spent a year on the campaign trail with largely with the Trump campaign.
Oh, how interesting.
And so I interviewed hundreds and hundreds of supporters. And it seems to me that they feel that the interests of Donald Trump and his real estate empire are aligned with the interest of the country. And so there isn't a conflict, because anything that Donald Trump does maybe to line his pockets while president is okay, because meanwhile he's making America great again.
But do they see his self-enrichment as enriching everyone, or are you just saying that they're happy when he's happy because he's serving their cause?
I think they think everyone would be enriched by things like lower taxes, less regulation, getting out of the Paris Accord, less programs that help the poor. They think that everyone would be helped by that. And that Donald Trump maybe is helping himself to things that he wouldn't legally be entitled to. But I think that maybe deep down, or somehow historically, they know they need a leader who's willing to basically break the rules.
I think that a person could pursue all of those policy goals that you mentioned without engaging in corruption and self-enrichment. I would urge them to try to separate what they want to see done programmatically from allowing someone to corrupt the very essence of democracy and turn us into a kleptocracy. Mm-hmm. What worries me as a constitutional scholar is that if we let these sorts of very serious offenses slide, we will never be in a position to raise the bar in the future and enforce the law. Once you've said, we don't want to enforce, or we don't mean what the Constitution says, we will allow rampant corruption from the president, how do you then, with a different president, say, oh, but in your case, we're going to enforce the law?
I think it's a clear-cut thing for you as a constitutional scholar. But for the average person who never even heard of emoluments, sure, they would want to see a quid pro quo. They would want to see policy that is not in the interest of the United States demonstrably. Let's say we invaded the wrong country or something for oil. Something like that.
It's hard to imagine how that could happen.
Right, or the Teapot Dome scandal, yeah, where maybe you could summarize that for the audience. They want to see something where we make a bad deal for the United States. Like, we gave away the Navy oil reserves to the two richest oil men in the country in the Teapot Dome scandal, and then heads rolled.
A good summary.
Okay.
And there was also a lot of bribery among very high-ranking officials in the Harding administration.
Not in the public interest, demonstrably.
So the first part of it is, does there need to be a quid pro quo to have corruption? And as a lawyer, I would say, not for purposes of impeachment. And there's a difference between criminal law and high crimes and misdemeanors that amount to impeachable offenses. When Nixon was almost impeached, there was a lot of research done about whether impeachment required a felony offense for which one could be indicted, and the conclusion was no, this was a different judgment. Alexander Hamilton wrote about impeachment, and he explained that it was really not for the usual kind of crime that the government could prosecute, or for an offense for which an individual could bring a civil lawsuit, but it was for crimes against the body politic. There is a different calculation about what's required to violate the public trust. And the Congressional Research Service, which is a nonpartisan government entity that issues very detailed studies, looked at all the impeachments in our history, most of which were of judges rather than, we've had 2 presidents impeached, 1 almost impeached. But there have been other public officials who were impeached, and they said the most frequent grounds for impeachment are obstruction of justice, which was the first count against Richard Nixon in the draft impeachment articles, abuse of power, and enrichment through office. So I think that helps to explain why it doesn't have to be a quid pro quo.
Well, for public opinion, though, I think it's easier to get your head around.
Yes, I agree with that.
Yeah.
And of course, now this is, I think, the biggest part of your question. What's the relationship between constitutional wrongs that a lawyer would conclude amount to impeachable offenses and the role of public opinion in politics? And there's no question that impeachment is a political process, and it won't happen until the American people either show that they're ready for it, or probably, in my view, until the American people demand it. President Nixon ultimately tumbled because of obstruction of justice. And he didn't do anything in retrospect that begins to approach what is going on today in terms of entrenched corruption. But even after we knew that he had tried to obstruct justice, it took a while for the American public to respond sufficiently that the Republicans in Congress, in other words, the people of his party, finally said, enough is enough, and we're going to vote our president out. And it is very much to Nixon's credit that he resigned rather than prolonging the crisis and the agony that the country was experiencing.
Okay, so you mentioned a level of character and statesmanship that I think is lacking on both sides of that equation.
Yes,
okay.
I think that's fair.
Plus, we have Fox News and Breitbart, an entire army of conservative Republican media products that are pounding people, especially in those gerrymandered districts where they don't have any other experience with America.
I think that's a great point. Many things have changed since 1974, and one of the most important is how people get their news. In 1974, the 3 major television networks, CBS, NBC, ABC, they dominated the airwaves. We had no cable TV. Everybody had a shared set of facts that we could talk about.
Well, that's why I keep asking, don't you need something to happen? Because if it's already known that he has these businesses in Azerbaijan and Turkey and the Philippines, and that's impacting Saudi Arabia, and that's impacting, or it appears to be impacting foreign policy, that's already known.
Let's even say may have. Because again, the founders were very concerned about the appearance of impropriety. They weren't asking about smoking guns. They said, even very, very early on in the early 19th century, when people were still alive who had helped to write the Constitution, they said even the smallest gifts from foreign governments require the consent of Congress. Because we don't want to start saying, when is a diamond big enough to really be a bribe? We're not going to get into that. We're going to have a very clear definition. No gifts without permission. I and many other people are very disturbed by Trump's repeated attacks on the press. The press is an essential component of a functioning democracy.
He doesn't like anything that is trying to find facts.
Nothing about, nothing about facts is good, right? We need facts, and that's also why the group that I'm involved with, Impeach Donald Trump Now, we are calling for the beginning of an investigation into all of the allegations that suggest that there may be impeachable offenses. We want the Congress to establish the facts. We're saying there's already enough that we know as a matter of general knowledge, but as lawyers, and I'm on the Legal Advisory Board, we would like Congress to pin down the facts But we're saying what we know, what appears to be true, indicates impeachable offenses.
Okay, so you're not saying impeach him, you're saying investigate.
Begin the process,
Gotcha.
because the process always has to begin with an investigation by the House Judiciary Committee.
And innocent until proven guilty.
And innocent until proven guilty.
I think the thing that could get most people going on this would be something in the foreign emoluments category. So do you have examples of things that have already happened?
Absolutely. So Trump has apparently extensive loans from a bank owned by the Chinese government. He rents to the Chinese government in Trump Tower in New York, the Trump Hotel in Washington, where foreign embassies are giving parties, and in at least one instance that we know of, canceled a contract with another hotel after he was elected to move the business to him, and where the Trump entity pitched the diplomats in Washington, made a sales pitch to them and said, the president will certainly know if you use our hotel.
Gosh. At least 35% of the population feels that Trump's interests and the country's interests are aligned. So China or Azerbaijan or the Philippines or Turkey or Saudi Arabia would have to do something that we really didn't like, and it seemed like it was enabled. I left out Russia, but it seemed like it was enabled.
I think we should talk about Russia.
Okay.
Because Russia is encroaching and threatening elections all over Western Europe, leaving aside what they did in our election, which we don't fully know yet. Russia is still fighting in Ukraine, which is a sovereign nation.
Trump changed the platform during the convention that basically says let Russia do whatever
do
they
what
want.
it wants to do in its zone.
Yeah, incursion into Ukraine. Nobody really batted an eye.
Well, none of the Trump voters batted an eye. A lot of people were concerned about that,
right,
because it was apparently at the behest of key people from Trump's campaign, who then denied that they had said anything about it. And boy, how did that happen? We don't have Trump's tax returns. We don't know what he's getting from the Russian government directly and from businesses that are controlled by and essentially owned by the Russian government, including banks. So, we have public records in which Trump's sons said, we have enormous investments from Russia. Now Trump says, no investments from Russia, right? So just like they had this show of all these files that may or may not have anything in them about divestment, which never happened, he got a letter from his lawyers recently that said he's not receiving direct payments and profits from Russia. It was very carefully phrased. I'm paraphrasing now, but the language was very careful. And as a lawyer reading that letter, I thought, well, they're not saying there's no income stream through entities that are traceable back to the Kremlin.
The people who are ultimately going to decide this, because our federal government, especially Congress, is gerrymandered to insulate the rest of us.
Very hard to change
process.
your congressional representative.
Right. So it's white conservatives with white racial grievances, and they see the culture war here as much more present in their lives. It's certainly much more on their TVs and on their radios than anything going on outside of our borders.
I would say that if those Trump voters look beyond the culture wars, which are essentially beyond the government's ability to remedy or prevent, look at what they're trying to do with health care. Tens of millions of people, many of them Trump voters, will lose health care and lose subsidies and really be hurting, and people will die. He said he was going to respond to the opioid crisis, which is rampant in red states as well as blue states. And now his budget says cut back on drug treatment centers. If I were talking to a Trump voter face to face, and I don't know how you voted either, but I would say, what is really most in your interests? To hate racial minorities and get the emotional satisfaction of that, or to try to have a world in which your children can have a job and afford a home and be treated if they have addictions and have health coverage.
The other possibility is that there's a level of conscience that rises above the personal political future of the lawmakers.
At some point.
Yeah.
And one, I really hope that that proves to be true.
Well, which case are you making when you talk about emoluments? Because that seems
That's to the lawmakers. I think that's very, very hard for average people to understand, and I think a lot of voters think rich people do this kind of thing all the time.
Yeah.
What's so different about it?
Yeah.
So I try to explain what's different about it, but I understand it's a pretty abstract concept, as you say, absent a quid pro quo. I think obstruction of justice is easier to understand, that when you just fire everybody who's investigating your people, there is something that is authoritarian in the worst way. And I know some people think, you know, we wanted a more authoritarian government. But where does that stop? And are they willing to, do they understand what it would mean no longer to be governed by rule of law, and what a protection it is for every single person in this country that we are a nation of laws and not of strong men?